All right, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Well, it's morning for me. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the channel. We are going to be in a just chatting today, so let's bring it up and get ourselves underway. Hopefully, not too much today. More, more stuff that's popped up in recent days that I hadn't previously had the chance to get to. Like I'm skipping a whole bunch of news stories that everybody else is covering. Kind of not really. I mean, they're of interest, but there's nothing I'm going to add to it, and nothing I have to say really that's going to do much. It is interesting to see the Friendly Geordies court case. Well, the court case in relation to the firebombing of Friendly Geordies rental in Sydney that happened a few years ago. Even though the court case, I think it was like last week or the week before, there was news coverage on it. It's now trickling out across more commentators online. And it's interesting to hear what they have to say about the alleged uh, reasons for why it happened or the various parties involved. And we'll certainly be covering something similar to that today, talking about corruption and integrity, like ICAC type level things. But anyway, look, let's get ourselves underway. First thing, we're going to go with international news. Well, international and military news. There's been a bit of stuff, but not stuff that, well, really valuable to talk about. First article, first thing we're looking at, from a couple of days ago, the NATO chief has mocked a broken Russian submarine. Uh, the NATO chief has mocked Russia over the limping condition of one of its submarines as Russian authorities denied it had been forced to surface because of technical problems. Okay. Black Sea is the body of water on the far side of the Bosporus, of the, uh, basically it's the body of water that Ukraine, Crimea faces onto, plus Russia, plus Turkey. Uh, it's where, Russia has a fleet, and keeping the Dardanelles open is one thing to allow the Black Sea Fleet access to the Mediterranean and therefore to blue water. The issue has been about, there's been talks or there's been rumours in the past about the idea that Turkey might close the straits to Russian military vessels, which goes down all sorts of interesting complications in terms of the United Nations Conventions on Laws of the Sea and transit passage and innocent passage and things like that. The Russians claim that they've relocated one of their submarines from the Black Sea or the Mediterranean around to the Baltic or around to the Arctic, but basically out in the more open waters. The They've run one of their submarines on the surface through the English Channel. And so people are saying, oh, well, the Russians had a severe malfunction, and therefore that's why it's running on the surface. Now, the Russians have said, nope. Other people have said, yeah, and that it's also on the tow and that it's broken and everything else. Um, yeah, okay. It's true that there's hardly any Russian naval presence in the Mediterranean, in part because Turkey's kind of being a bit annoying in terms of uh, any, they're not necessarily requesting for the Black Sea Fleet to leave. I mean, the Black Sea Fleet is quite obviously quite busy with what's been going on between Russia and Ukraine and protecting the various Russian assets that front the Black Sea. So they're not going to be moving from the Black Sea out into the Mediterranean. So whatever's in the Med has probably come in from uh, either from Murmansk or uh, Kaliningrad or St. St. Petersburg. I think that's the place. So coming out of the Baltic or around the top through by the Arctic. It's more than likely though that they would have sent vessels out from the Black Sea fleet in the past, but at the moment they've got bigger things that they're worried about. So obviously, yeah, it passing on the surface, perfectly fine. Uh, so they're being shadowed and stuff. Again, that's not necessarily an issue. Um, the fact that they're sending naval units to monitor and observe, everybody does that, to be quite honest. Um, the Russian Black Sea Fleet said the submarine is conducting a scheduled interfleet transit after completing tasks in the Med. Perfectly fine. The thing, though, is when we talk about unnecessary rhetoric and anger and useless reporting and stuff that it, to people who understand the laws of the sea or the various international laws pertaining to territories and territorial limits and things like that, it makes it, well, it seems very scary, a lot of the terminology being used. And this isn't necessarily just being focused on what Russia does, it's a ramping up of rhetoric that, quite honestly, doesn't need to be said. In fact, there shouldn't be anything about it. It's like saying, talking about um, patrol aircraft approaching international airspace, or so national airspace limits, up to the 12-mile limit and everything else like that. We talked about this previously at length about the fact that, okay, in an ADIS, they're probably going to be identified, but there is no obligation. There is being a um, polite member of the international community in terms of notification, but there is no requirement for that notification to go ahead. So when you have statements like this coming out, it particularly when it's clear that there is no breach and there is no threat and there is no issue with what is going on, it's not one nation pushing, not the One Nation Party in Australia, but it's not a nation pushing the limits of what is acceptable. They're acting completely within the boundaries of international law. It's the response which is out of order and is excessive for what should have been. Now, why am I saying all this? Okay, a submarine running on the surface through the English Channel. There's a couple of elements of the international law. So, UNCLOS, which is the governing uh, international set of agreements and laws. And we've talked about this in terms of airspace. Now, we're looking at this in terms of water space. There's two parts to it, and I've talked about in the past the idea of a transit, of a straits transit. Uh, we're going to go with the Wikipedia stuff. I mean, I could go into the actual UN conventions and dig deep, but look, we'll stick with the Wikipedia because it's a nice high-level overview, and it has enough of the correct information to show that what the Russians are doing is completely fine, and it was the NATO response that, or it's the response by Rutka that's well and truly out of line, and is not a case of, well, we're dealing with a pariah. It's, I mean, the French boarding the Shadow Fleet tanker slash cargo vessel a few weeks ago, perfectly fine. There's existing allowances in the various international laws for doing so, and there's stuff out there that can be looked at. It's fairly available to be looked at in terms of operational law, what military commanders and operators will get to look at in terms of or consider when engaging in a military action or engaging military assets to carry out an action, not necessarily combat, but particularly when you're dealing with nominally neutral or civilian platforms, and what you can and can't do and what you can expect to do. And it also then goes into operational, also goes into what rights and roles exist for neutral parties and belligerents, and what counts as a neutral party in terms of if a nation or a body is doing certain actions, they can't claim neutrality and may present themselves as legitimate targets and all that sort of stuff. Which is why I've been saying what I've been saying. It's not a case of I'm picking one side or another. I'm looking at it from a position of what the laws of armed conflict present, what constitutes war crimes, which influences the laws of arms conflict as well, and what the various international treaties and laws that are out there have to say. And when you put all that stuff together, you realize that the situation, one, isn't the way the media seems to report it. Two, that there are there is complying with the intent and the letter of the law. Now, sometimes people will comply with the intent but not the letter, and other times people will comply with the letter but not the intent of the various laws and treaties and obligations and things like that. When you take all that into consideration, you realize that a lot of this stuff that is being uh, couched in inflammatory terms in the media and by politicians and people like that really isn't. It's fairly routine procedures and operations. It's just that people who've not had experience with it or don't understand the underlying background to it tend to get all excited and get can get wound up very quickly as a result. The drawback being then that allows people to apply pressure on politicians, and well, politicians ultimately make the decision what happens with the militaries, and bad things can happen as a result. Not because there was a hostile act or hostile intent. These are completely benign, neutral operations, but through the lens of somebody who doesn't understand what they're looking at, it's like, well, no, no, no. So yeah, it's not taking sides. It's, well, take the side of peace, but it's encouraging people to slow down and actually have a look at what's going on. So, with that said, there's two aspects here. The first one is the transit passage, and this is what I've said about in terms of archipelagic transits and straits transits and things like that. Now, I'm not going to go into the definition of a strait or an archipelagic transit under the convention or anything like that. We're going to accept that a vessel transiting through the English Channel, which is what this submarine was doing, and eventually the Denmark Straits, it's called something else, but anyway, but these are locations where straits transit are considered to be in effect because there's no high seas or uh, EEZs belonging to the nations on either side, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so all ships and aircraft enjoy the right of transit passage. Cool. Hopefully, no one's in disagreement with that. Now, and this is also then Turkey's rhetoric and the rhetoric pushed by other people about Turkey having the ability or should be able to block the Russians from taking their Black Sea fleet or merchant traffic out of the Black Sea and into the Med or back in the other direction. You can't do that. You can't close the straits arbitrarily like that. Now, Russia and Turkey have been fairly friendly in the past, but you can't make a stop like that because the moment you do that, well, that opens a huge can of worms for other things, and people tend to rely on these allowances for their own military or their own civil things. You're risking the moment you start doing things like this, you risk shutting down major global shipping routes. I mean, the Straits of Hormuz, the Malacca Straits, the Formosa Strait, the even the access to the Suez Canal, the Panama Canal. I mean, they're under their own special considerations. So, in accordance, right of navigation and overflight solely for the purpose of continuous and expeditious transit between one part of the high seas and another part. So, what that means is once you enter, you keep going until you get out the far end. You can't stop and look and do other things along the way. Now, if you're suffering mechanical issue or other issue preventing your ability to continue, some places there's setups to allow for that, like turnout zones and other bits and pieces. But basically, once you enter, you carry on until you get out the backside. All right. Whilst not all countries have ratified the convention, pretty much everybody agrees that this is the way you do things. They accept the rules. Okay, so yeah, um, so we come down to um, transit passage exists for all straits used for international navigation where there is not a simple alternate route and excludes those instances where there's a long-standing international convention governing the straits, such as the Danish Straits, Turkish Straits, Straits of Magellan, and um, the Beagle Channel. Now, major international trade routes are the Strait of Gibraltar, so in other words, access to the Mediterranean from the Atlantic, Dover Strait, which is the um, English Channel, Hormuz, access to the Arabian Gulf, um, access to the Red Sea, and access through the Malaccas from the Indian Ocean to, well, the Philippine Sea, West Philippine Sea, South China Sea. Yeah, it depends on who you want to call it. And then the canals, major canals, have their own treaties. Okay, so we understand that vessels are allowed to do this. It goes throughout the entire strait, not just the overflowing areas. Ships and aircraft of all nations, including warships, enjoy the right of unimpeded transit in such straits and their approaches. Cool. Submarines are free to transit international straits submerged, since that is their normal mode of operation. Transit passenger rights do not exist in any state's internal waters. Okay, so internal waters, yep, everything else. Now, we're not concerned about that. So, the Russian submarine transiting the English Strait, so the English Channel, the Dover Strait, and thus the English Channel, has every right to do so while submerged, according to the Conventions on the Law of the Sea. Okay, so the Russians so far are allowed to be there. They're actually allowed to have their submarine running under the surface, as long as it's going south to north and north to south, in accordance with it. There's a related concern called innocent passage. So an innocent passage is a concept in the law of the sea that allows for a vessel to pass through the territorial seas and certain grandfathered internal waters of another state, subject to certain restrictions. So this is more, I mean, the way I was taught it was more that it's the archipelagic transits, or it's things like port visits or anything else. These are the sort of things that when piracy is being considered or being defended against by civil traffic off, say, off Somalia there for a while, plus in other high piracy regions around the world. It's why they're not carrying armed guards into port because of the right of innocent passage. You can't, well, we'll look at it as we go through it, but you can't have armed, postured guards, and you lose your rights to certain merchant traffic if you do. Even militaries can't be doing certain things, can't have activated weapons, all that sort of stuff. There's limits on what you can and can't do in terms of innocent passage because you're entering another nation's territory at this point. Now, that may mean there may be a means for you to navigate between islands and things like that, but it's considered that nation's territory, and in essence, you're there as a guest. Now, you may be there without their permission, again, permitted to do that, but you need to observe certain conventions about what you do or don't do. Main thing is, it's innocent so long as it's not prejudicial to the peace, good order, security of the coastal state. In other words, don't do something to upset the people whose waters it is. As long as you do that, everybody's cool. All right. You cannot exercise or practice with weapons of any kind. So these merchant vessels that bring aboard security teams cannot have those security teams aboard while entering a place where they're partaking in innocent passage. In the high seas, not a problem. Inside somebody's territorial limits, they can't have it. All right, so you'll generally see at sea onboarding and offboarding of these security teams because the rules prevent them from bringing them inside territorial waters. Because in essence, you're now relying on the security, the maritime security of the adjacent state to provide that security. Now, the fact that some states can't provide that security or don't provide it very well, that's a separate issue. Any act collecting information, so in other words, intel collection, is generally precluded. Active propaganda aimed at affecting the defence of security, yep. Launching, landing, or taking board of any aircraft, so from the military, you're talking about aircraft carrier operations, landing ship, helos, helicopter issues, launching, landing, or taking on board of any military device, gathering intel, etc. Loading or unloading of commodity, etc., contrary to the rules. Active pollution, fishing, well, territorial EEZs have rules on that too. Research or survey activities, etc. Aimed at interfering with any system of comms. Well, as long as they don't get caught doing it, I guess. So that'd be things like dragging anchor cables to break um, internet and telecommunication. So dragging anchors to break submarine cables. Um, that sort of stuff inside territorial waters. Yeah, naughty, naughty, naughty. I mean, generally most people are upset with that anyway. The key thing here is underwater vehicles like submarines are required by the treaty to surface and show their flags during innocent passage. Um, it applies during the territorial seas. It's similar to transit passage, but has the different requirements because of all this and the fact submarines come to the surface. So we go back and look at what Russia was doing with their submarine as they were going through the English Channel. Now, I can't see on that picture whether or not it's got flags out, but then again, I can't see if the French have their flags out either. But for it to be on the surface running like that, they're engaged in innocent passage. They're allowed to do that. We just looked at it. The laws explicitly permit them to do that activity. They appear just to be transiting, at least according to even the article stuff. And the fact then that they then meet up with a submarine tender at sea, there's plenty of um, plenty of nations have and use submarine tenders. Doesn't necessarily mean that it's been um, suffered a major mechanical issue. Now, yeah, there is plenty of Russian military hardware that in the past has suffered from severe mechanical reliability issues, but there is no indication here that anything other than a innocent passage has been engaged in. So we've seen that the laws establish that. Now, NATO well and truly understand this sort of stuff. And they, okay, there's a lone and broken Russian submarine limping home from patrol. And this is coming from the NATO's General, NATO's chief, basically, he's mocked Russia over the limping condition of one of its submarines because it was running on the surface. Now, the Russians said it's to comply with navigation rules in the channel. Okay, we just showed that the transit passage is what applies during the English Channel, and that, if anything, the Russians are exercising innocent passage because they're running their submarine on the surface. Given the bathymetry of the English Channel, I suspect it's probably fairly dangerous to be running a submarine submerged north to south through the English Channel, and that running it on the surface is a safety thing. So it it seems again that we have belligerents, we have people making claims and fanning flames that don't exist. That, well, the only reason they exist is because the people making these claims want them to exist. That the thing that they're targeting is completely innocent. And I don't understand how this encourages peaceful interaction, how it encourages anything other than ongoing suspicion and not fear, but reluctance by various nations to engage, not in military engage, but to be open and honest with each other. And it makes NATO look like clowns. If you want if you want people to believe you and to trust you when you're talking about more violent outcomes or conflict that's underway, and you want us to believe your position and that what you're telling us is true in regards to that, don't be making don't be uh, making a mountain out of nothing when it is quite clear by all the rules out there that the activities you're upset about are completely permitted. Then there's nothing in them that is um, hostile, and it removes trust. I mean, we've talked at length about other aspects of society at the moment where trust has been eroded, and so you come out with things like this that's going to erode trust in your organisation, trust in what you can do. Yeah. All right, let's move on. We had a bit of a talk earlier this week and last week as well about various aspects of the under 16 social media ban that's coming up in the next 8 weeks, 6 weeks here in Australia. And one of the things that had been talked about in the past, people weren't really giving much attention to it. It seems like there's a lot more attention being given to it now, and there's also a lot more attention or a lot more pushback coming from the various social media companies. One of the things I saw, which I thought was a bit odd, and it's not in this article, but there's there's two things which I think are a bit odd. The criteria that's been applied when they say that, okay, you count as a social media company has to do with the ability of, or what the purpose of your service is for. Is if the purpose of your service is to allow messaging and that's its prime purpose, the messaging between different people, then it counts as a part of the social media ban. And they've put YouTube in that classification. I'm like, well, I always thought YouTube's primary purpose was to host videos and ads, but to host videos and show them that. The comment chains are, well, a secondary aspect. the main reason for YouTube being YouTube is video hosting, but they're being targeted as a social media company, presumably because of the comments. And well, that's a bit of a dangerous precedent to be setting, because then that means message boards, any site that has comments, surely then counts as social media, which would be funny because whilst the ABC doesn't have comments on their ads, on their articles, um, there's other media still does to an extent by those very same rules. Does that imply that those sites are also social media? Well, they're old school media. The other aspect too that showed up was what services are then added or removed from the ban list. There's guidelines and there's legislation sort of describing things. By the very nature of the legislation, it's fairly broad. It's got specifics. You then have to work out how those specifics apply to your particular service. There was an admission that it can come down to, I think it was the communications minister, but basically it comes down to the personal decision of one of the federal ministers as to whether a service gets added or removed from the list. At which point, that should have sent a bit of a chill through people, because you're then giving an individual, I mean, Julian Grant seems to have power far beyond any remit or ability of the population to appoint or remove her from that remit, but you're then giving a member of the government carte blanche, effectively, to cut off services and or to arbitrarily define things. And for people, I mean, anything from political speech to freedom of speech advocates to, there's many different grounds you could look at this as being problematic. And the idea that you can then suppress speech just because you disagree with it is going to mean that people are going to look at any decision ideologically. And uh, that sort of thing is a bit concerning. And I mean, some people have pointed out as well, hey, look at what's happened in places like Nepal and Madagascar, where they've attempted to ban or severely limit social media sites and content. See what happened to the population. Eh. So, the article here, though, is talking about whether Roblox is going to be included or not. Now, if anyone's been paying attention online any time in the last, well, several years, but again in the last few months, Roblox has been coming under more public awareness about the degree of exploitation that goes on within the player base, and in particular the exploitation of underage people for various really nasty outcomes. Now, a lot of it is taken from Roblox and onto other services like Discord, or well, mainly Discord is the link that's provided in many of these cases, but it starts on Roblox. And I mean, Roblox has plenty of other aspects in terms of payment to developers and how they pay. Yeah, there's a lot of things with Roblox that people are upset with. But if we're going to just focus on the communication aspect, the weird thing is that the e-safety commissioner here seems to be taking the position, oh no, they're an online gaming service. No, they're fine. And it's like looking at just a broad brush look at the what's going on out there in the broader world. People are upset at Roblox for inadequate moderation and for the predators that well, roam its service and exploitation and everything else. Yet they, I mean, now they do say the same thing about Discord, I guess. Yet in all the complaining people have about X/Twitter or even Facebook, you don't, or Insta and other services Meta provides, or even on YouTube, you don't tend to hear that as well. I mean, those things still do exist, but doesn't seem to be to the same sort of extent that Roblox is accused of. And, well, ABC didn't reveal that. It was done by people online. Now, there will be an announcement coming out. Now, this was from the 14th, though, a few days ago. So perhaps by the end of the week, we'll see a new list come out as to the additional services added or not added. Uh, the statement here of, oh yeah, we've taken Roblox to task. No, you haven't. Roblox is busy denying things online, and they don't care what the Australian E-Safety Commissioner says. They're not based in Australia. Well, Roblox isn't. Um, but yeah, warn the online gaming platform may not be included in the upcoming social media ban. Um, well, it wasn't. The ABC were following everybody else's lead on it, so they're a bit late to the party as well. And it's yeah, fair enough. I mean, I agree with the parents saying, look, if you're going to come out and ban these other services, please ban Roblox. It's not safe for kids. Uh, and so, well, what I was just saying before, the law only allows the ban to target platforms whose sole or significant purpose is social interaction. So how does YouTube meet that criteria? I, I mean, it's not what YouTube was created for, and so I don't understand. I mean, and that's the other thing too. Is I haven't heard of, say, Twitch or Kick or Rumble or Odyssey or any number of these other similar type services being focused on like this. Now, it may appear when we get the list at the end of the month or the end of the week that that's the case. Maybe they're going, well, they're only going after a handful of sites right now. But if you're talking about the purpose being social interaction, all right, okay, if we're going to assume the reason for YouTube being targeted like this is live streaming on YouTube, then any live streaming service would be considered vulnerable in the same way. Twitch, you can't say that Twitch is community, online communities and chat and everything else is not a direct, it's not a significant purpose of what it's doing. I mean, it started out as Justin TV, but a significant part of Twitch and live streaming and Kick and everyone else is the social interaction. So surely under the way she's described it, all these other services should be banned from the under 16s. Now, it doesn't take long at all to find under 16 streamers or commenters or viewers on any of the streaming platforms. Now, are they permitted to be on there by things like COPPA and other legislation? Well, some of them no, but it's it almost feels like it's agenda driven, and that the suspicion about the e-safety commissioner's role is that it is being used uh, to strike down or to target services and platforms and content that isn't being done even-handedly. Now, if it was done even-handedly, I think people have a lot less of an issue with it. Not the fact that content's being precluded from being seen, they'd find, I think, more bipartisan rejection or acceptance of what's going on. Whereas the way it's going on here, it clearly opens the doors to suggesting that it is agenda driven and potentially even ideologically driven. So, uh, Roblox said they've strengthened their moderation and yeah, no, I don't believe that. Age for yeah, no, I don't believe that. We have come to an agreement where they'll employ new safety measures. I no, no, no. I guess it's a feeling that the E-Safety Commissioner thinks that um, that they've gained some power. Roblox have failed repeatedly previously to address these sort of issues, and I don't think Australia has the leverage to force Roblox to do any of this sort of stuff. And yeah, they're going to do facial estimates. No, no. The changes are not part of the social media ban. Um, yeah, existing regulatory powers. Again, I don't think Roblox are doing this because of Australia. Uh, yeah, you can threaten form regulatory action. They said no, we'll work with you. I know the ACCC, Australian Consumer Competition Consumer. I can't forget what the exact label is, but the ACCC tends to stand up for the rights of Australian consumers against vendors and suppliers and everything else. They are very good for enforcing the rights of consumers, and Australia has some very good consumer rights protection laws. The ACCC was responsible for Valve finally allowing for refunds, in part because I think they can't remember if they did take them to court or just threatened to take them to court. But the under Australian law, consumers are entitled to a refund for goods that are not as delivered, not fit for purpose. And as a result, Valve changed their policy and eventually introduced refund policies to more of the world. So the ACCC, the Australian side of things, certainly has the ability to influence and lead to changes internationally. Whether or not the E-Safety Commissioner has that level of influence, I don't think so at the moment. I don't believe so. Um, given given the focus and the attention Roblox is already under for what's happened in the past, yeah, it's an easy compliance for them to say to fob off Australians. Oh yeah, no, we're working on that. We're fixing that. Not because Australia asked, but yeah. Anyway, um, they need to implement these to our satisfaction by the end of this year. That's that's not a nice statement. I mean, yeah, great. Roblox needs to tighten their restrictions on things and be much better at their moderation and everything else. That's not uniquely an Australian concern, but that almost sounds like a threat. That it's not being done in terms of partnership with the industry or anything like that. It's coming down as a do it or else. It's very authoritarian, and yeah, I think people should be a little bit concerned about how that's been put forward. Um, so only 6 platforms at the moment currently set for being targeted: Snapchat, Insta, Facebook, TikTok, Twitter/X, and YouTube. So two, well, Facebook and Insta. Again, some of these things, I yeah, the given that it's due out in December, the fact that we don't have clear guidance on who, what, where, and when. Well, we know when, but we don't know who's going to be included and the exact criteria. Oh, and even now, so we're in October. It's less than 2 months away. I I struggle with that, and also the statements that then come up as to why someone should or shouldn't be part of it. That's yeah, like we don't know. We don't need to continue. Obviously, companies don't believe they should be included in the bans. They're primarily, they say, oh, we're an immersive gaming platform, not a social media platform. I don't know that. It's yeah, it's a struggle. Um, and no, so yeah, we'll see where that goes. All right, next one. Returning to returning to infrastructure, housing, that sort of stuff. This came out this morning, an article about them having a look at the available rental properties that were listed for lease or rent over the weekend, or over the last period, that the number of properties that were affordable for certain classes of worker were remarkably unaffordable. So they looked at it, Anglicare Sydney. So, okay, they're going to have a focus on social welfare. So they're going to be talking more about low income earners and therefore the unique concerns and problems that they will have. And obviously talking about, well, the risk is if you can't live near where you work, you're then going to be pushed out to fringe suburbs, you're going to have longer commutes, your overall quality of life is going to go down. Okay, it was March, not current. Okay, so they looked at the New South Wales property market on a single weekend in March. 17,000 listings, and then classed how affordable they were for a worker to spend no more than a third of their income on housing, which is the basic rule of thumb that, well, I guess it's sort of breaking down now with $1 million+ basic houses, but it's the basic rule of thumb that's existed forever. And so out of 17,000 listings, they determined that only 500 were suitable for a school, like were affordable for a school teacher, only 200 for an aged care worker. Now, they've since had a pay rise, so they might get a few more. 162 for people working in hospitality, and so on and so forth. The breakdown that they had was looking at, well, not just Sydney, because obviously they're focused on Sydney, but all across the state. You've got, it was like 3/4 of the rental. There's a figure further down in the article, but there you go, right up here. Greater Sydney had most of the rental properties, with 3/4 of them being in the Greater Sydney area, but basically being unaffordable. So out of 3/4 of the available rental properties, only 100 in the Greater Sydney area were considered affordable for school teachers, firefighters in the same bracket, and so on and so forth down the list. Nurses, 45, um, construction workers, 38. See, some of these occupations, you look at it and you go, well, some of them are going to be on a fairly low wage. Early childhood educators tend to be. So, in other words, people working in childcare centres tend to be relatively low paid. Hospitality as well tends to be a fairly low paid or low income environment. But you'd think that nurses would have, I mean, they're professionals. I mean, you'd normally think of them as being middle class, yet they could afford less than half the properties that school teachers can. And same goes for fireys and ambos. You'd expect them to be on a decent salary, um, maybe not a high middle class salary, but certainly above blue collar worker salary. You'd be lower middle class at least. But the affordability indexes, the affordability is so low. And all right, so Greater Sydney still had 75% of the availability, but even then, for the rest of the state, and there's some pretty decent population centres. So across places like Newcastle, Wollongong, the major regional centres, Bathurst, Wagga, Orange, Tamworth, Grafton, Lismore, did I say Dubbo? Probably Dubbo as well. Coffs Harbour, Gosford, Port Macquarie, no, the other places, Ballina, and then you got all the other centres down south as well. Albury, I say Wagga, and then Griffith, Narrandera, places like that. I mean, places with tens and, well, some of them have hundreds of thousands of people. Some have a million. I mean, Greater Wollongong, I think, is nudging a million. Greater Newcastle and Hunter is also, I think, nudging a million. And so you've got these large population centres that, and even, I guess, in the high tens of thousands, nudging 100 plus thousand for some of the more regional centres. You've got a total of, what, 400 houses across the state outside of Sydney that are considered affordable for school teachers, or 200 affordable for nurses. There's a lot. It's not just the ability of people to afford a house to buy. There's just nothing out there at the moment. I mean, it's a shortage of stock, full stop. Um, just trying to think. There was an article not long ago, and I can't remember where in Australia it was looking, but the re- rental vacancy rate was less than 2%. Now, there's a certain, it's like unemployment in a way. The market needs a certain level of vacancy. There needs to be a certain degree of unemployment for the economy to be strong, because it allows for people to move jobs. You need people to come out of one job, a little bit of time as they then search and acquire a new job. There needs to be a bit of a float, because that then means that the like, it's not too strong for employers, it's not too strong for employees. There is the ability to have mobility. If your employment rate skyrockets, it means obviously there's a lot more people looking for work, and it becomes, the incentives then fall on the side of the employer, because they're going to have a lot more people applying for jobs. If the rate is too low, there's not enough people applying for jobs. It puts a brake on economic development and economic growth, because companies and workers can't get the people in that they want or that they need. So there needs to be like a certain amount. Similar sort of thing with the rental market. There needs to be a certain percentage of available properties for people entering the rental market, for people looking to change existing rentals. So from moving from one to another, end of lease, breaking lease, all that sort of stuff. Many reasons why someone moves out of a rental. People going from share houses to their own place, all that sort of stuff. And so there needs to be a certain percentage in the market that is vacant. And as long as that percentage doesn't grow too much, it's considered a healthy figure. It gives enough mobility in the market that if there's too many vacancies, rents are suppressed and people and investors leave the market. If there's not enough vacancies, rents skyrocket and it prevents renters from being able to move around. And so there's these competing interests the whole time. And as long as you don't end up in a place where there is excessive property vacancies, but none of them can be let, well, why aren't they being leased? Is it because you're asking for too much, or because the market's not there to move in? You're not stuck with too many places that can't be leased. And the short lease versus long lease, i.e., holiday rental versus normal lease, is complicating things too because it influences properties that may have normally gone to a longer lease are now being chasing higher value with shorter leases, but sitting vacant more often. All those sort of issues. So we want a certain percentage of vacancy. And if those vacancy rates are too low, then we're going to see things like this where affordability crashes through the floor. And for a lot of these people, they may not have readily available alternate living conditions. Now, if you're young and you're single, then shared living arrangements can be viable. But for people with families and things like that, if they're not already living at home with parents or even a multi-generational household and that has its own issues as well, which isn't necessarily normal for a lot of Australians, then uh, they don't necessarily have the ability to go into share houses or things like that. So there's further pressures on people moving in and out of rentals and stuff, and it's housing insecurity in a way. And it's yeah, I mean, people living 90 minutes from work in Sydney. I mean, 90 minutes. I don't know that it's a huge distance, but this person, it's interesting. He lives in Paddington, so that's considered more inner city, but commutes to, sorry, he works in Paddington, but lives in Western Sydney. I had it the other way around then for a second. Yeah, I don't think a care manager is ever going to get paid an amount that would allow them to live comfortably in Paddington. Well, I don't know that he lives comfortably in Western Sydney, but he's not going to be able to get paid enough to live close enough to work. Not without significant lifestyle changes or considerations. So yeah, rental apartments near work in Paddington, thousands of dollars. Yeah, that makes sense. But yeah, public transport for up to 3 hours a day, it's a cost. It takes almost half a workday on top of your existing work. It comes at a cost. There's a social cost. So, and then you have the same thing of with the with unemployment rates. If it's too high, people eventually stop looking. Well, renters stop looking as well. So it comes back to affordability, and people talk about affordable housing, not say public housing, but affordable housing. And yeah, I mean, obviously they're focusing mainly on Sydney, but there's the there's the issue, and then there's pushback from low density established suburbs to rezone areas to medium or high density, which will give more housing stock, more housing supply, maybe in the form of apartments or units. But there's pushback on that. In fact, we've got an article coming up that looks at it fairly shortly. I mean, we're sticking with no, we will. Yep. Okay, so sticking with housing and accessibility, we had a talk the other week about the proposed sell-off of significant military assets around Australia, including these colonial era barracks in the inner cities in Sydney, Brisbane, Melbourne, Hobart, Adelaide, although Adelaide's one has already been transferred to the state government, I believe. and barracks in Perth as well. Don't know about Darwin. I mean, Larrakia and Darwin is pretty central. I can't imagine them selling that off. But when we talk about location, all right, we can point at a map all day long and things like this. Victoria Barracks in Sydney, in Paddington. So we just had a look at that previous article about a bloke who works in Paddington but can't afford to live there. Beautiful old sandstone colonial era main building, um, PT green at the front. But this in the background is the Sydney Cricket Ground and the Sydney Football Stadium. All right, so if you're looking for now, I can't remember the aspect here, but I think the city is off this way, I believe. I mean, it's not far. It's I have walked from the CBD to Paddington because there's a hospital here. I thought, oh no, I'll walk until I catch a bus. I walked the wrong direction. Not the wrong direction. I just um, didn't see the right bus. So I walked the whole way. It wasn't excessive. It was long. But the point being, you've got um, SCG, SFS, you got Moore Park, which is significant green space in the area. Um, you used to have, I don't know if it's still there, State Athletics Centre. They called it ES Marks Field. Don't know if that's still there. They may have got rid of it when they built the Olympic Stadium. They also had, well, they have Fox Studios, or it's now Disney Studios, which, no, that's it over the back there, which actually used to be the Sydney Showgrounds. So there was actually quite a lot of open space as such in this um, area. Sydney Showgrounds, now they got moved out to Homebush when the Olympic site was being developed. They developed part of that into the showgrounds and basically kicked them out of, or they moved out of their traditional site, which then got turned into Fox Studios. So there's been plenty of open space in this area that's been nabbed up and redeveloped in the last 20 odd years anyway. The idea of taking these other heritage sites and destroying them, uh, yeah, the idea, I guess, I suppose, depends on what side of the city you're on, they say. There's another barracks up in Parramatta that they're looking at selling off as well, and there's people who are going to say, look, you don't want to destroy the heritage. And a statement like a number of properties within the defence estate that really have their history as part of something in the past and not necessarily focused on the future comes across as a statement of heritage doesn't matter. We're going to get rid of them and redevelop them. And so, question is, what should they be turned into? Are they remnants? They are remnants of a past military age, yes, but there are certain elements of it that should be preserved for history. There was a brick bull ring, they called it. I think it was part of like a SAR yard slash abattoir slash meat processing slash whole bunch of things. Now, Adelaide has some interesting elements to it, but there was a brick bull ring, sorry, and it was unique. I believe it was the only one of its type, either in South Australia or Australia. It was like really, 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 really unique. A developer bought the site, and obviously because it was, well, it's outside of Jepp's Cross, so it was used to be miles out from the city, but now it was sort of in the middle of suburbia, but still sitting on fairly waste land. There was a nearby small light aircraft training site that had, so there's plenty of aircraft flying over at low level, lots of aircraft noise. There's still industry in the areas around it. It was between two main roads. It wasn't a site that was necessarily ideal to build on for housing. The developer that bought it had trouble getting approval for the developments that they wanted to put down on the site. I think at the time it was reported that it was a pushback because there's too much of the heritage was being lost and not enough was being preserved. And so there were certain aspects of the site that needed effectively heritage protection until one day there was a mysterious fire that burnt the place down. And then because it was unsafe, they had to bulldoze the entire site into the ground. Now, it was denied by the developer that they had anything to do with it, but it, Adelaide wasn't that big. There's not too many people who had. Uh, I mean, most of the community wanted to keep the place, um, and I mean there was still ways they could have worked around it, but no. In the end, I mean they were certainly going to keep it as an active sale yards or anything like that. But in the end, a key part of South Australian heritage just got destroyed through neglect initially. And then the suburbs that they put um, in adjacent to the airport, people started complaining about aircraft traffic. And it's like the airport has been there for close on 60 years of that, I think even longer than that. And you got the suburb hadn't. But no, they built a suburb basically right under the approach path for two active runways, and then people complaining about plane noise. It's like the airport's there, uh, but but see, it was one of the things that where there was the opportunity to preserve a significant historic site. No, do away with it. And Adelaide, that wasn't the only thing Adelaide destroyed in its desire to develop. Now, Adelaide has green zones, a green, what do they call it? A green belt, green buffer. Basically, there's actually protected zones that limit how far the city and suburbs can spread because of the way the city was set up. It basically puts a hard limit, not because the terrain's not viable. No, it's just a hard limit on how far the city's allowed to spread. So you then have this greenbelt jump to then a regional site, which is almost hard up. Now, in most other cities, that regional site would eventually become part of the city itself of extended suburbia. In Adelaide, no, you've got this green belt. Um, it's a great idea, but it means that you then have to increase density inside that area faster. And so one of the other uh, heritage unique sites was a landing site by Sir Kingsford Smith. And I don't know whether it was the first landing site of an aircraft in South Australia or there was some really, really important aspect to Sir Kingsford Smith having landed in South Australia. And so this landing site effectively was little more than a paddock. But at the end of the day, it's a key part of Australia's aviation history. And for the sake of keeping it green space or open space, it could have been preserved. I mean, it wasn't like there was massive numbers of buildings or unique construction. It was just, hey, look, it's a place where aircraft can land or did land. It's important to Australia's history. Got built over. A suburb got plopped down on top of it. And the exact landing site was lost. They believe they put a park on top of it, but it wasn't really a park, and it certainly wasn't big enough to capture the entire heritage parts of the site. Um, and there's a kids' playground on top of it. And so you go to the suburb now, or a couple of years after it's been built, and there's no reason it should stick out as to what took place there or what was important about it. So Australia's doesn't seem to protect its heritage that well. So yeah, I mean, people say that so these military sites should be turned open for housing. Now, this is obviously focused on Sydney's stuff, and you got some very stringent advocates for and against, and the idea that some people suggest that Victoria Barracks here should be torn down and we put in 40-story skyscrapers uh, to inject diversity. Well, obviously this guy's got an ideological bent for things. That said, the idea that the suburb has only managed to put in 24 dwellings since 2011 census, yeah, something needs to be done. You, your suburb is getting stagnant and more expensive, but to only have basically now is that approving or actually building? I'm not 100% sure, but to only allow one building a year or one dwelling a year change in in close on 15 years in an area like this does not make sense. Um, Now, I mean that's what he said. I don't know if that's the full figures. Um, Clover Moore, obviously, yep, okay. Uh, Not often that a significant amount of inner city land becomes available, so any change consultation, but increased access to parkland. Well, see, that's not a problem. I mean, the idea of turning that into parkland, I don't think anyone has an issue with. It's the heritage aspect of these structures. I don't know if that's part of it, but certainly of the barracks itself. As long as they can be preserved, um, I'm sure the idea of parkland, green space, public access, not an issue. Uh, I think the fear that people have is that the heritage aspects are going to be destroyed. So yeah, they talk about a site out at Parramatta um, where there's issues and people are saying look, are fighting over whether it should be turned into development or kept for public space. Um, the whole site out there is heritage protected, so that limits therefore what can be done unless it can be done. Now, reading the comments, there's a lot of people like, oh no, we should destroy things, should not destroy things. There's people saying, well, look, heritage is important. Heritage is important. So, yeah. But it's not as simple as saying that. Now, these are government owned, but it's not just that though. We've got articles, and there's one here from October 12. There's another one I've got from a few days before that, where you've got um, Rose Bay. Well, that'd be worth a lot of money, especially what do they call it I can't remember my house design. So it's a Queen Anne. It might be. It's early Federation. It's not a Federation. It's a cottage. I seriously think it's a Queen Anne. But I'm probably very wrong on that. Anyway, it's been a while since I looked at housing design era stuff. But anyway, this idea is that homeowners who have their house block, and a lot of the house blocks are now much smaller, but they group together to sell as part of a mega lot. In other words, you've got a property developer who wants to slap down some high-rise apartments and that sort of thing, but they're not going to fit on the footprint of a standard house block. They need to have a parcel. They need to have a much larger parcel of, say, 5 or 6 house blocks or more. And so they kind of get together and uh, sell together as a mega lot. And in this case, they sold the megalot, well, ideally sold it for close to $55 million. Fantastic. Um, Selling up because she doesn't want to have her house with a tower block looking over it. Fair enough. But the idea is, I know you've got people in Rose Bay, and so if you know where Rose Bay and places like that are, you're like, well, yep, I can kind of understand why people are complaining about that. The fact she's then moving to an apartment in Vaucluse, um, well, God, obviously they've earned a lot of money because of it. I mean, even Marrickville. I mean, Marrickville's working class, not in a west or southwest really. It's I always thought of Marrickville and places like that as really. I mean, they're not. They used to be fairly cheap because they were adjacent to Mascot or near Mascot, and so therefore the airport. They also used to be fairly industrial for many years, but their proximity to the city centre, to the CBD, has obviously seen their value change or go up a fair bit. So you got people there who like, look, we don't want to sell our house. We like our house, and that's a nice bungalow style. Not quite California bungalow. I think that is the name they use for it. Obviously, they've closed in verandas that were probably open in the past, but I mean that's uh, 1950s maybe. I mean it's 100 years old now. Getting so not quite 100 years old. They're nice houses. So um, it, yeah, they're not interested. Concerned about obviously what's going to happen to the heritage of the suburb, but at the same time, um, you're trying to increase the density. Increasing in value means your rates shoot up. All sorts of problems trying to keep things on. Trying to keep people want, yep, increased density, but they don't want the high density increases. It's not just saying, oh, well, we've got this regulatory restriction. You can't magic land out of nothing. You've got to get the existing people to sell up. And in the case of these large developments, you need to have multiple units selling at the same time, so that multiple blocks selling at the same time, so you can build the higher density housing. So these mega lots where you're selling grouped housing and stuff like that to then allow the larger development to go in. The idea that Rose Bay is going to turn into something like Bondi Junction, I can see that not going down well with people who live in Rose Bay. um, and so you've got this concern where people are like, well, hang on, should I sell up because it's a lot of money, or do I want to stay put because I've always liked living in Rose Bay? And you've got this idea, like where people, this statement here from the local MP, that it seems like an arbitrary approach to planning where there's desperate drawing of circles on maps. It kind of does appear like that as somebody from outside trying to observe and see how this goes. Now, the Sydney Morning Herald, of course, are going to focus on Sydney, but you shouldn't think that this is unique just to Sydney. They're, this is affecting pretty much most metropolitan areas around Australia, in fact, most larger sites. Oh, but maybe not to the same extent. Um, the idea, and then this comes down to it's almost in fact, it is a prisoner's dilemma as to how you, uh, like when you agree to sell into a mega lot, if payment isn't forthcoming, because it's not all of these developers have the cash up front to pay the full amount, or they're not financed. They're basically relying on apartment pre-sales to fund development and also to fund the purchase of the land. And if there's delays getting approval, then the agreed upon sale price at the time for the property is not going to be the value of the property when it's eventually settled. It could be years later, or the development may fall through, and therefore the initial vendors are left high and dry, and or there's concern where, well, if you want to get out early, get your payment, it may take a lower amount but guarantee sale. you've got this idea where, okay, you've got a group of people with a nominally a common interest, but the moment issues start coming in, it becomes a race for money. And the first out generally will get the money that they are owed or close to it and bug out long before whatever eventual development takes place on the site. And potentially you're then stuck with people who held on and waited, who are then unable to sell because now their existing property is uh, being overlooked by these massive tower blocks and stuff, and so they lose out on the eventual value. And the idea that, yep, you've band together, delight that you've yep gotten a bigger money than usual. However, the reality being, it rapidly turns into the prisoner's dilemma, and people suddenly turn against each other. Yeah, the moment you bring money into things, and the idea that if somebody bails early, they're going to walk away with more than everybody else, yeah, it tends to upset people. Completely understandable. So the options here. Um, And the same for not just mega blocks, but large house blocks. I mean, 2,000 square meters in Rose Bay. Wow. What a not a surprise that it's in the tens of $1 million. And the idea um, that these things don't go ahead as well, there's all sorts of issues going back and forth and everything else. And oh, that the agreements and ideas, and a lot of this stuff is just, as I say, it's not worth the paper it's printed on. They're trying to lock in deals and they're not working, but at the same time, there still needs to be land. So the issues are going to be, well, how they're not necessarily going through, um, and they're not going through for the same value. It's going to be scary. Eventually, it'll go through. I mean, uh, but that's that one. The other article from a few days previously was a group in near Castle Hill for development. They all had, freestanding houses, there's tower blocks and stuff nearby. So they banded together to make a mega sale, first one in Castle Hill. But the issue was, okay, so they were supposed to have a $42 million offer for the entire thing. They get three and a half, close to three and a half for their house, but it's more than 10 years later and it still hasn't sold. The plan still hasn't gone through. Only 3 out of the 10? How many numbers were there? 10 neighbours here. So 11 out of, so 30% have been paid in full. And everybody else is sitting there waiting because the approvals for the tower blocks and stuff haven't come through. The developer is waiting on the sale to fund and finance pre-sales and everything else. And so you had these three owners being paid in full was because they eventually legged it. And so the prisoner's dilemma. And instead of staying together and holding out, it, I mean, that's a lot of land on the waterfront. It, the article here, so delayed settlement and stuff like this. Okay, so what went wrong? They knew that it might be up to 2 years before they get settled from 2015 to 2017. So, before the agreement officially exchanged, they settled on the full amount in 2017. Okay, we're now 10 years later. Can't imagine the prices has gone down in that time. Had they received their money back in 2017, They could have repurchased and everything else and done lots of other bits and pieces, but it then got sort of went to poo. And like the other article said, more often than not, it goes to poo. And so the initial proposal for the two towers, 2017, got knocked back by the council. Some of the 11 negotiated an early settlement for a discounted price, and so they basically settled almost immediately in and around the same bracket. But as soon as people found out that this had happened, bang, everything falls apart. It's it's a classic prisoner's dilemma, and it's kind of interesting to get these really clear examples of it taking place, and it's the psychology, really. People fear that if they don't move and um, make their deal first, they're going to be left not just with the consequences, but they're going to be left with something that is not worth what they thought it was initially. Now, 10 years in Sydney, I think their property values have gone up, but still, they had this agreement to sell 10 years ago, and it's impacted their ability to do anything with the property since. So, yeah. Um, Stricter lending rules is at fault. Well, I don't know if you're claiming that that's not good enough. Yeah, developers need a great number of pre-sales before they can begin construction. Clearly, the plan was not only was it knocked back, but yeah, um, the pre-sales market died overnight. Well, there you go. Wasn't going to go ahead. Don't know why people seem surprised. Uh, yeah, return on investments smaller. Blah 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 blah. There's plenty of reasons why it's falling through, and they're now getting offers to sell at offers to complete at a reduction on initial prices and to waive penalties. I don't. I think um, people are going to hold out. It's been long enough. Basically, they're going to have to walk away, and the company that's gone in on it is going to have to take penalties. Plus, you wouldn't be putting money into maintenance at that point because you know the place is going to get knocked down. Yeah, it's now obviously developers are facing costs, uh, which are completely unsurprised. Plus interest, and it's just there's a reason why people have uh, have concerns about property development and approvals and stuff in and around Sydney, and there's been allegations of over years, and there's been people gone to the corruption commissions and stuff like that, big based on this sort of stuff. Property development and approvals in and around Sydney is well, wasn't a clean game for many years. But yeah, so there are those articles. Okay, so that's it um, for housing. I'm going to go back to cost of living stuff, and it kind of ties into infrastructure. So, article came out yesterday where the not Sydney, it's actually Women's and Children's Hospital. So you're talking about Adelaide. Adelaide doesn't have necessarily, like we were talking before, doesn't have the density of everything else. Where Women's and Children's Hospital in Adelaide is, it's in North Adelaide, around plenty of parkland. It's near the Adelaide Oval. Um, so you've got the city. Across the river, you've got Adelaide Oval. You then go up a hill, you're in North Adelaide. On the right is Women's and Children's Hospital. And it's near the zoo and other parkland, stuff like that. What it tends to lack, though, is there's not a lot of um, parking nearby. It's a little bit, but it's not the density that it really needs to be. And now, I don't know whether they've improved it at any point in the last 20 years, but the available parking was a problem way back then. And so nurses are saying that they're copping parking fines because of a shortage of on-site parking. Yeah, I mean, not a surprise, really. There's really little pop. I mean, because a lot of the stuff that where there is construction or built-up areas nearby, it's largely not pedestrian, residential. There's a little bit of commercial, no industrial. It's a fairly medium density area, except for the uh, parklands. And so the available parking, a lot of the residential sites aren't built, they don't, well, didn't have off-street parking. So all the people who lived in the adjacent areas are parking on street as well. The commercial zone down through North Adelaide also had effectively zero off-street parking. So you'd park on the street. There's small car parks in a couple of places, but the only real off-street parking was the hospital, and there was a small multi-story, but it's not just the women's and children's. See, from this angle, that would mean there's another hospital right here, the repat, and there's a small multi-story car park on the other side of it there. There was barely enough parking for people attending the hospital, let alone people who work there. Very, very little guaranteed parking. And it's not just women's and children's here. I mean, I've heard from other hospitals in major metropolitan areas that, yeah, the available staff parking is either very, very small or they're parking in a paddock, in a locked in paddock, and then have to walk a few hundred meters to get to the hospital, to get to work. And it's just, uh, yeah, they don't have enough parking, full stop, irrespective of staff or visitors. And so some park in the hospital's public car parks, which cost up to $20 a day. Well, $20 a day for undercover parking, not too bad. But the allocated parking isn't enough, and so yet they're going to public, and then they don't want to take it because it fills up spaces that the public need. And yeah, there you go. Nearby street parking, but they don't have long enough to accept it, and therefore you can't be guaranteed times to go and move your car, and so you're copping parking fines. And then safety concerns for people walking to and from their cars. Um, Canberra Hospital, I remember a couple of years, I think several years ago now, they had a couple of nurses hit and killed crossing the road out the front of the hospital at a crossing with the green light, so with the green man. So traffic had a red light, someone ran the red light and ran them over. This at like 3 o'clock in the morning, 3 o'clock in the morning, end of the night shift or overnight. They were walking back to their cars, which were across the road in staff parking, and yeah, so there's risks associated with it, and safety issues. Yep, definitely. And so this concern has been there for forever, really. And then it's on street parking only, and it's an issue. And I mean, and the idea that it's something where you should be able to negotiate restrictions for staff. 20-minute walk from the hospital, yep, that kind of makes sense. But you can't afford the fines or the parking. And true, public transport's not an option now. Again, I don't know what it's like now, but essentially there was no public transport that ran directly to the hospital. The main routes were a block or two away, so it's not massive distance away. Or um, where we are, back up here to the picture. So the Women's Central Hospital actually sits on an entire block. On the far side, I don't think it matches. I can't recall exactly, but basically it's a full-size block. The public transport connections are more the other side. Small park, like small bus stops and stuff over here, but they're not necessarily major routes. And so if you're living further out in the suburbs, you've got to take the Oban, etc., to get in, and the connections aren't necessarily there. And the person being spoken to is a student nurse, so she's not going to invest massive amounts of money securing a permanent solution when she's only there for a month. So it would be good to see the numbers develop. It's just too many. It's yeah, and it's not the only thing. I mean, Flinders Medical Centre, pretty sure that's the one in the south of Adelaide. They've had similar issues for ages, and Adelaide Hospital, the one north on the in the city itself, they've had similar sort of issues. So yeah, it's not an unknown issue. All right, look at the time. We'll take one more, I think. Victoria. This was interesting when it came up a couple of days ago. Obviously, there was an article a week or two back talking about the secret submission, or the secret, not secret submission, the secret witness statement or examination of the Premier Dan Andrews at the time, in relation to a number of cases in front of the IBAC, the Corruption Commission in South Australia, in Victoria. And there's been plenty in terms of activities by public figures, government, um, the political parties. There's been, I mean, you've got corruption at any number of levels. I mean, there was a case a few years ago of a food services provider in Western Melbourne. I'm not sure if they're outside of Melbourne, but they received a failing grade from health inspectors, and they had CCTV footage of their site, and they alleged that the health inspectors um, had placed the various items and incident that got them the failing grade. That the food services company was like, no, 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 our site is good, and we can show you the footage to show that. And but it meant a court case. It meant fighting it out in court to do it. And in the time frame, in the intervening period, they'd been forbidden from providing. They'd basically been shut down from a public health on public health grounds, and it effectively destroyed the company. The court cases that went ahead basically alleged corruption in the public health inspectors, and I'm fairly sure that was accepted that it was a corrupted inspection. But the inspection, and there was an element of competing food service interest being owned by a councillor, I believe, of a nearby council or the council involved, and basically their competing firm then took up or was able to secure the contracts and everything else that this other food services firm had done. And so it went from it just being a case of, okay, you've got a dirty inspector who's basically extorting a company, um, or shutting down a company for false reasons. to a much broader corruption of it being politically driven by somebody who had their fingers in a pie that they shouldn't have had and had therefore used the health department as or the public health system, um, to shut down a competitor. And, well, I mean, there's corruption all over the place in Australia. I mean, Friendly Geordies uh, has become controversial for, well, become well known, but also attracted controversy and a lot of people who don't like him because of his focus on corrupt activity in Sydney, in particular, and the various powerful figures involved in that. Um, Now, New South Wales has had ICAC for many years, and that's actually got some teeth and has done fairly well for itself in terms of managing that. But then, who watches the watchers? There's been massive corruption problems in Australian states and various public sector things over the years. I mean, there was Victorian Police, New South Wales Police, Queensland Police. They had massive corruption problems that went through a big period of cleanup, and people say that's still ongoing in some things. But anyway, we're looking at Victoria. And so you've got, as the article says here, you've got in various integrity agencies, you've got IBAC, Ombudsman, Auditor General's Office. The thing that surprised me, and presumably the point of the article, is that their funding currently is set by government. So whoever's in power at the time determines how much money these anti-corruption and agencies get. They're basically saying, well, look, we think it'd be fairer if Parliament said it. So not the people in power, but the entire Parliament sets it, which makes sense. It makes it more bipartisan. It helps remove the idea that the government can act to suppress investigations into itself by by turning off the flow of money, or use a potential conflict of interest of using that flow of money to influence which direction these integrity agencies look. Now, you'd want to avoid those sort of assumptions and those sort of interpretations. So taking the funding decisions away from a political party that is in power as the government and returning it or giving it to the parliament as a whole, well, that just makes sense. I don't know how anyone could oppose that. However, the agencies told the newspaper, I don't think it's necessarily the Sydney Morning Herald, I think they might have told The Age, that there had been no commitment or substantive action by the state government to quarantine their budgets from political pressure since they publicly raised the matter before the previous Victorian election. And they've come together to say it. So obviously, if they're coming together to say it, they obviously feel very strongly about it. Um, and that they're doing so in part because there is a falling public confidence in Victoria's integrity system. Well, no, obviously it's coming up as well because there's a national anti-corruption conference, but still, the idea that, well, they're failing to meet, or the public's losing faith in them. Question is, it, it is that because of the last few years or because of longer history? I, I, I don't know, but the public doesn't believe it, which makes it hard for them to, I guess, do their job. And, well, yet they're saying that the funding risks the ability of the agencies to do their body and do their work and erosion of capacity. It's interesting to see the ambivalence of Australia, of the population to things. So your red and your dark green are your very bad and very well performance in general of uh, the role that the government and various agencies at various levels is doing to fight corruption. Yeah, more people think that the federal government is doing worse, but you've got this massive band in the middle where it's, oh yeah, they're not doing a great job, or oh, they're doing an okay job, or really just don't care, not going to give you an answer. It's only a very small bracket that think they're doing a great job. You you got a broader, well, more than half at the federal level say that they're not doing a great job. But you look at the Victorian levels, yep, okay, Victorian respondees, they're saying that, well, they disbelieve the federal government more than everyone else. But, and I guess in part, people are just saying, well, how do you how do you trust a body that says, oh, we investigated ourselves and found ourselves without fault? Well, of course you're going to have a bit of a return on that. The idea that, and so this idea of independent funding or independently managed funding, which I think is, that I'm saying, it's profoundly in the public interest. Yep, it's going to help reverse these red and salmon areas and hopefully increase the green areas. I don't know. It's just, I would have thought there was more faith the um, in the anti-corruption system than a third, a quarter to a third of the respondees. I mean, like I said, the example coming out of New South Wales from ICAC, I think ICAC, I don't know if they were the first, but first anti-corruption commission, um, they seem to have a very, very good track record for many years. And it wasn't done on a partisan basis. They seemed to go after people reasonably fairly in terms of things. And they had the teeth to um, to deliver on it too. And well, I mean, at the time, that was the news I was hearing all the time was coming out of New South Wales. But it gave hope that governments weren't beyond redemption in terms of being corrupt, that there was hope for the everyday individual who was having to deal with government agencies and various government bodies or trying to live an honest life, that they weren't going to be taken advantage of unnecessarily. Now, the cynic would say that you're always going to be taken advantage of when you work trying to get something done with the government, but there's being taken advantage of, and there's being taken advantage of unfairly, and so people were trying to get to this point of, look, we don't mind it too much as long as you're fair about it. And it's like um, accepting a certain rate of corruption. You know it's going to happen, but uh, the moment you step beyond societal acceptance is when there's a problem. And then it came to light that a lot of these agencies and things, and it's part of it's the problem of people just rising to levels of power that um, they probably should never have, or money, the offer of money and crime and all these other bits and pieces. That it's and then there's also the problem of any organisation. People would say that the people who seek power are the ones who should never be given it. Well, eventually people get to that point. So again, returning to the Victorian focus, I think the idea though is to have that funding is good. Now, since they funded issued the report calling for better funding, government funding for IBAC and the Ombudsman hasn't changed; it's flatlined. Whereas the Auditor General's has got a little bit of an increase. Um, yeah, it's comparable. I mean, I don't know how it's within a percent or two. Obviously, they've got a vested interest in getting their funding secured, um, but yeah, it comes down to this question of transparency. How can these anti-corruption bodies be transparent and perceived neutral in their work if their funding source isn't? And so, yeah, um, I don't know necessarily that's an issue of the Australian Labor Party, given that they've been in power in Victoria during this time frame. I don't know that Labor's got any unique reason why they're keeping it this way. I don't think the coalition would make a decision any differently. It doesn't seem to be an ideological reason behind it. At least I don't think I've heard anything from um, the government otherwise. The government spokesperson says a bunch of things, but then says we expect all public sector bodies, including the integrity agencies, to manage their budgets and ensure public money is spent efficiently, effectively. Brevity. Uh, that's not what they're concerned about. They're not concerned about the ability to spend their money efficiently and effectively. They're concerned about how that money arrives to them to be spent. They it seems like there's obviously, I mean, I, it being a government spokesperson, obviously they've been given a message to say, but it doesn't seem to make sense. Yeah, this statement is not abrogated by a change in how the funding is allocated. They'd still spend their money in the same way. Uh, I don't know necessarily that the opposition spokesman has an accurate point here. Uh, that you can draw a direct link between insufficient funding to the integrity agencies and more public sector corruption. I don't think the argument is necessarily the level of funding. I mean, I'm sure they want more money. They'd love more money. Everybody wants more money. They're talking about the path to funding, but at a broader level, yeah, okay. Public sector corruption, people are concerned in Victoria. Uh, we saw that they're just going through the figures here compared to what they showed just before. Here you go. Budget independence is a concern for integrity agents. Yep, previously did a good idea. Uh, so they've started down the path, but they never got there. This idea up here that they said how New South Wales runs it seems pretty reasonable. That they've got a Department of Treasury, so that's yeah, and they then report to Parliament about appropriations to integrity agency. I mean that makes sense. It's coming out of the government department as a say out of the department, which is going to be there no matter who's in power, and they report to the Parliament, not to government. I mean that makes sense. I don't know why people are concerned, why the people have an issue with it. Um, that I mean, you could argue it's almost a part of their role, what they're trying to do. The Integrity Oversight Committee. Ooh, that's that's an interesting name for a group. They have a statutory obligation to review the budgets of integrity agencies, but in practice, this is stymied by the advice from government instructing the agencies not to provide the committee with their annual budget bids, which are treated as cabinet in confidence. Ah, so they've got a group that should be doing it or potentially has the ability to do it, but government is telling the agencies not to talk to them because their budgetary bids are considered sensitive, classified as such. Uh, yeah, it's toothless in that regard. I mean, it may have other teeth in other sectors, but in that specific aspect, yeah, they've neutralised it. Um, And yeah, the Greens asking for further reforms. Of course they are. Yep. Integrity agents need the courage provided by independent funding. Yep. No, that's great. Yeah, just surprised that I mean, not surprised really. The government's pushing back on it. Just surprised that a Labor government's doing that, given their public pronouncements about being progressive and socially justice aware and failing in practice. All right, we'll call it there. I mean, there's plenty more I could talk on, but we'll knock it on the head. So, put some tunes up. Not that one. We'll go with that. Okay. Big thank you to everyone coming out today. Regulars, first timers, chatters, lurkers, and everybody in between. Your presence here in the various channels is very much appreciated, and it wouldn't be the same without you. So thank you very much for all being here. Apologies to anyone who's hoping to catch the gaming stream last night. That didn't go ahead. I was caught out with some real world stuff. Next stream is going to be tomorrow night. Well, actually, we may have a Just Chatting stream again tomorrow. There's stuff I didn't get through today that, even if no news articles come up, there's still historic stuff to go and have a chat to that ties into stuff we've already been talking about, and it's going to be useful to have a chat about. Other than that, the stream after that will be tomorrow night with Prince of Persia Warrior Within. We've also got Subnautica streams over the weekend, Extreme Exorcism on Monday, and hopefully Pillars of Eternity next Wednesday. If you want to keep on top of all of it though, check the socials. Messages go out on... Why is that not coming up? Go out on Twitter and Insta before each stream, indicating what we're when. They eventually come across to the Discord as well, and the Discord also puts out a message when the stream goes live. We also have giveaways running on the Discord. This week is for a copy of Return to Monkey Island, so there's plenty of stuff over there if you want to keep on top of things. But otherwise, enjoy the rest of your day, evening or night, depending on where you are, and we'll see you all again next stream.